January 1952, Washington, D.C. Winston Churchill sat across from President Truman, negotiating the future of the Western Alliance. On the table was a rifle, not figuratively. An actual rifle had brought the Prime Minister of Great Britain to the American capital, because 3 months earlier, Churchill had fired that rifle at his country estate, put 20 rounds downrange standing in the cold November rain, and scored 9 hits at 100 yards. Then he fired the American competitor, managed 11 rounds, and declared he did not wish to fire the damn thing anymore. The American rifle kicked too hard. The British rifle was superior. Churchill knew it. The British Army knew it. American trials had proved it, and none of that mattered. Churchill travelled to Washington as the political question of NATO standardisation reached a head, and he chose alliance unity over unilateral adoption. The weapon in question was the EM2, officially designated Rifle Automatic Calibre .280 No. 9 Mark I. It was the world's first military bullpup rifle designed for mass production. It featured the first integrated optical sight ever fitted as standard to an infantry weapon. It fired an intermediate cartridge that British scientists had calculated from first principles to be the optimum balance of power, range, and controllability. The rifle was 35 inches long with a 24.5-inch barrel, 9 inches shorter than the American M14 despite having a longer barrel. It weighed under 8 pounds unloaded. It was, by virtually every technical measure, a generation ahead of anything the Americans were developing, and Churchill killed it anyway. This is the story of how Cold War politics destroyed Britain's most innovative rifle, how American stubbornness forced NATO to adopt an inferior cartridge, and how the United States Army would spend the next 2 decades learning that the British had been right all along. The M2 never saw combat, but its ghost haunted the jungles of Vietnam, where American soldiers died with jammed M16s in their hands, fighting with a rifle that embodied every mistake the British had warned against. The M2 emerged from a converted drill hall in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, where a team of immigrant firearms designers worked under the direction of the armament design establishment. The chief designer was a Polish refugee named Kazimierz Stefan Januszewski, born around 1906. He had worked at Poland's FB Radom arms factory before the war, served in the anti-aircraft regiment during the 1939 invasion, been captured and interned in Hungary, then escaped through Yugoslavia, Italy and France to reach Britain. He became a naturalised British citizen in 1947, and in October 1950 changed his name by deed poll to Stefan Kenneth Jansen. Jansen led a team that included Stanley Thorpe, who designed a competing prototype codenamed Cobra and operated under Lieutenant Colonel Noel Kent Lemon. The scientific foundation came from an even more distinguished source. In late 1945, the Ministry of Supply established the Small Arms Ideal Calibre panel under Dr. Richard Beeching, the same man who would later become infamous for his railway cuts. The panel's mandate was to determine the optimum infantry cartridge from first principles. Their March 1947 report recommended a .270 to .280 caliber projectile of 130 to 140 grains at approximately 2,400 feet per second. This was revolutionary thinking. The panel had studied German-captured documents on the 7.92mm Kurz round used in the STG-44, recognised that most infantry combat occurred at ranges under 400 yards, and concluded that the traditional full-power rifle cartridge was wasteful overkill for actual battlefield conditions. The adopted cartridge, designated 7mm Mark IZ, fired a 140-grain bullet at approximately 2,550 feet per second, generating roughly 2,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. The recoil was calculated at roughly half that of the existing .303 British round. A soldier could carry 30% more ammunition for the same weight, and crucially, the reduced recoil made automatic fire controllable from the shoulder. The rifle built around this cartridge was unlike anything the British Army had fielded before. The bullpup layout placed the action behind the trigger group, with the magazine inserted into the buttstock. This allowed Jansen to fit a 24.5-inch barrel into an overall length of just 35 inches. By comparison, the American M1 Garand measured 43.5 inches with only a 24-inch barrel. The EM2 gave soldiers a compact weapon without sacrificing ballistic performance. The mechanism used a long-stroke gas piston mounted above the barrel, driving a flapper locking system derived from the German Gewehr 43. 2 locking flaps in the bolt were forced outward into receiver recesses by the firing pin sleeve. On firing, the gas piston first retracted the firing pin sleeve to unlock the flaps before carrying the bolt rearward. The system was elegant and reliable. Perhaps the most forward-thinking feature was the unit sight type BX-8E2, a fixed 1-power magnification optical sight integrated into the carrying handle. In 1950, optical sights were reserved exclusively for sniper rifles. The EM2 made every infantryman a more accurate shooter by reducing the traditional two-element iron sight picture to a single plane. Backup iron sights were mounted offset to the left for emergency use, but the optical sight was the primary aiming system. This concept would not become standard until the SUSAT sight on the SA-80 in the 1980s. The rifle also incorporated an automatic bolt release that compensated for the bullpup layout's slower reload. When the magazine was empty and the bolt locked back, inserting a fresh magazine automatically released the bolt to chamber a round. The shooter never needed to operate a separate bolt release lever. This small detail showed the depth of thought Jansen's team applied to practical infantry use. Production costs presented a challenge. According to War Office estimates, 5 EM2s cost the same as 6 FN FAL rifles. The bolt carrier assembly alone reportedly cost £50 per unit in pre-production, equivalent to over £1,000 today. Mass production might have reduced these figures, but the rifle was never given that chance. The collision between British innovation and American obstinacy began at Fort Benning, Georgia in 1950. The US Army conducted extensive comparative trials, firing approximately 57,000 rounds of .280 ammunition. On October 27th, 1950, the Army Field Forces Board No. 3 released its findings. The board's conclusion deserves to be quoted directly. The T65 calibre .30 is not satisfactory because of its excessive recoil, blast, flash and smoke. That the calibre .280 is not satisfactory because of its relatively high trajectory. That of the two basic types of rounds submitted for the test, the British calibre .280 is preferred. The board recommended development proceed in .280 calibre. The Americans had tested both cartridges in automatic fire. The results were devastating to the T65, which would later become 7.62 NATO. At 100 yards, automatic fire testing showed that only a single bullet from each burst even hit the target frame. The rifle was uncontrollable. The .280 British, by contrast, allowed accurate automatic fire. 3 board members strongly objected to the recommendation. Colonels Burton Lucas, C.W. Pence, and Edward Chazal sided with the Ordnance Department, which had been developing the T-65 under Colonel René Studler. According to military historian Edward Ezell, Studler was openly hostile to any non-American design, reportedly stating that testing foreign weapons was a waste of time. Ezell concluded that American rejection of the .280 was not for legitimate technical reasons, but rather a thinly veiled display of national, institutional and personal biases. General J. Lawton Collins, the Army Chief of Staff, overruled the Fort Benning recommendation. Several senior US ordnance officers had pushed for the T-65 from the start, and historians note that institutional biases shaped how the trials were interpreted. The American position rested on doctrine rather than evidence. US Army thinking insisted that riflemen should be capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Never mind that combat studies consistently showed most engagements occurred at 300 yards or less. Never mind that the average soldier could not hit a man-sized target at 1,000 yards regardless of cartridge power. The Ordnance Department wanted a full power round, and Colonel Studler would accept nothing less. Britain attempted compromise. The armament design establishment developed several modified cartridges, including a high-velocity 7 by 49.5mm loading and a compromise 7 by 51mm version using a necked-down T65 case. These pushed velocities to 2,700 feet per second and beyond, but as ammunition historian Anthony Williams notes, these compromise loadings substantially ruined the favourable fully automatic characteristics. The balance of the original concept had been lost in the attempt to satisfy American demands that were themselves based on flawed assumptions. On April 25, 1951, Defence Minister Emanuel Shinwell announced in Parliament the adoption of the EM2. Churchill, then leader of the opposition, immediately attacked the decision. The parliamentary exchanges on June 13th capture the ideological divide. Churchill asked whether Britain should make a great effort to produce this entirely new and isolated type of weapon at a time of great pressure in rearmament. Shinwell replied, "It is all very well for the right honourable gentleman to live in the past, but we have to look to the future." The future, it turned out, would be determined not by technical merit but by alliance politics. On August 2nd, 1951, Canadian Defence Minister Brooke Claxton convened a meeting at the Pentagon with Shinwell, US Secretary of the Army Frank Pace, General Collins, and French Defence Minister Jules Mock. Canada declared it would adopt .280 only if the United States did, since the Americans had already decided against it. This was a death sentence. When Churchill's Conservatives won the October election, the new Prime Minister summoned the Enfield team to checkers. According to Brigadier J.A. Barlow's notes from the demonstration, now held in the National Archives, Churchill fired the EM2 standing in cold rain, then fired the American T-25, and refused to continue because of the unpleasant recoil. Despite acknowledging British technical superiority, Churchill told the assembled officers he was concerned with an Atlantic pool of weapons and was not prepared to proceed on Point 280 unilaterally. The comparison between what Britain proposed and what America delivered exposes the full scale of the tragedy. The EM-2 measured 35 inches overall. The M14, adopted by the US in 1957, measured 44 inches. The EM-2 weighed 7.7 pounds unloaded. The M14 weighed 9.2 pounds. The EM-2's .280 cartridge generated roughly 2,000 foot-pounds of energy with controllable recoil. The M14's 7.62 NATO generated over 2,500 foot-pounds, with punishing recoil that made automatic fire useless. The M14 was obsolete within 8 years of adoption. By 1965, American forces in Vietnam were transitioning to the M16 in 5.56mm, a cartridge generating only 1,250 foot-pounds, far weaker than the .280 the Americans had rejected as insufficient. Now, before we examine what went wrong with that decision, if you are finding this deep dive into British engineering valuable, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, takes a second, and helps the channel grow. Right then, back to what happened in Vietnam. The M16's problems in Vietnam are documented in the ICORD Subcommittee Report of October 1967, formerly titled Report of the Special Subcommittee on the M16 Rifle Program. The core failure stemmed from a change in propellant powder. The original rifle design used DuPont's IMR stick powder. In 1964, the Army switched to Olin Matheson's WC-846 ball powder, against the explicit warnings of designer Eugene Stoner and manufacturer Colt. The bull powder produced glass-like calcium carbonate fouling, altered the pressure curve causing extraction failures, and increased the cyclic rate from roughly 850 to over 1,000 rounds per minute. Combined with the absence of chrome-lined chambers, missing cleaning kits, and Colt's marketing that claimed the rifle required little maintenance, the results were catastrophic. Soldiers received rifles with no instructions on how to clean them, and ammunition that made cleaning essential. At the Battle of Hill 881 near Khe Sanh in April 1967, Marines experienced widespread jamming. Artillery liaison officer Joe McDavid testified that they found dead Marines with broken-down M16s as they tried to fix jammed weapons. Many Marines were found with AK-47s taken from dead enemy. Hundreds of letters from soldiers survive, including one reading that out of 40 rounds fired, the rifle jammed about 10 times. Hypothetically, a gas piston-operated rifle like the EM-2 might have avoided these specific failures. The long-stroke piston system keeps combustion gases and fouling out of the receiver. The .280's heavier brass case would likely have been less prone to the extraction failures that plagued the thin-walled 5.56. The EM-2's compact profile would have suited jungle fighting. However, intellectual honesty requires acknowledging the limits of counterfactual analysis. Only 59 EM-2s were ever produced, all hand-built prototypes. Testing 57,000 rounds in controlled conditions differs fundamentally from millions of rounds in combat. The M16's problems were primarily institutional rather than inherent design flaws, and once addressed in the M1601 variant, the rifle became excellent. A 1970 President's Blue Ribbon Defense Panel concluded the M16 actually saved approximately 20,000 American lives compared to continued M14 use. Britain's own later bullpup, the SA-80, suffered catastrophic reliability problems requiring a complete Heckler & Koch rebuild, suggesting British bullpup mass production was never straightforward. The SA-80 is mechanically unrelated to the EM-2, based instead on the American AR-18 design. The EM-2's legacy is not what it achieved, but what it represented. British scientists had correctly identified intermediate cartridges as the future of infantry weapons. British engineers had correctly anticipated integrated optics, compact bullpup layouts, and controllable automatic fire as the keys to infantry effectiveness. British trials had correctly demonstrated these advantages to American observers who chose to ignore the evidence. The final irony came in 2022. The US Army selected the 6.8mm SIG Fury for its next-generation squad weapon program. The cartridge specifications are remarkably close to what British scientists recommended 77 years earlier. The .280 British fired a 140-grain projectile at 2,500 feet per second. The 6.8 Fury fires a 140-grain projectile at 3,000 feet per second. After decades of 5.56, the Americans concluded they needed something more powerful but still controllable. They arrived by a different road and after much unnecessary suffering at essentially the same destination the British had mapped out in 1947. The EM-2 sits today in museum collections, including the Imperial War Museum and the Royal Armouries. About 59 prototypes were produced across several batches by RSAF Enfield, Chambon's Tool Company, BSA, and Canadian Arsenals Limited. Variants included a short paratrooper carbine, an Arctic winter trigger model, 7.62 NATO conversions designated X2E1, and experimental versions in compromise cartridges. The final batch of 14 rifles was completed at Enfield in May 1954. 2 originals were later rebarreled for an experimental 6.25mm cartridge around 1970. Jonathan Ferguson, keeper of firearms and artillery at the Royal Armouries, and author of the definitive Thornycroft to SA-80 published by Headstamp in 2021, describes the EM2 as enjoying a near-mythical what might have been reputation. The mythology is not entirely unearned. Churchill made the right political decision given the strategic circumstances. NATO standardization mattered more than rifle quality, in the context of Cold War alliance cohesion, but the technical record is clear. The Americans were mistaken about cartridges, mistaken about rifles, and the cost of those errors would be paid by soldiers a decade later. Britain surrendered technical superiority for political unity, adopted the Belgian FN FAL in the American cartridge, and watched the United States spend 2 decades learning lessons British scientists had published in 1947. The EM2 was not a perfect weapon. It was expensive, complex, and unproven in mass production. But it was right. Right about intermediate cartridges, right about bullpup layouts, right about integrated optics, right about controllable automatic fire. The Americans rejected it because admitting British superiority was politically impossible. 70 years later, the US Army is building rifles that embody EM2 principles. The ghost of Stefan Jansson's vision walks the battlefields of the future, wearing American uniforms, firing American cartridges that would not exist if British scientists had not first proved the concept. The EM2 never won a battle, but it won the